"I have been watching that empty chair," he said, "and I think it belongs to you." Susan Hawthorne froze with her hand on the door of the Silver Creek saloon, her travel bag still clutched against her chest, red dust from the Arizona Territory road coating the hem of her skirt. The man who had spoken was sitting alone at a corner table, his broad shoulders catching the late afternoon light that slanted through the grimy window, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical force pressing against her sternum. Around him, the saloon buzzed and clattered with the noise of men who had forgotten what manners looked like, and yet somehow his voice had cut through all of it to reach her, clear and low and certain, as though he had been rehearsing those words for a long time. She did not know this man. She did not know anyone in Redemption, Arizona, except for the name on the letter folded inside her traveling bag, the letter that had brought her 900 miles from St. Louis on a rattling stagecoach with blistered feet and a broken engagement, and a secret she was not ready to tell anyone. The chair across from him was indeed empty. It sat at a slight angle, as though someone had just left it, or perhaps as though it had been waiting. Susan Hawthorne had spent the last 6 weeks running from a trap. She had not expected to walk straight into a new one the moment she crossed the threshold of the first building she entered in this God-forsaken town. "I beg your pardon," she said, because her mother had raised her to be civil even in impossible circumstances. "Sit down," he said. It was not unkind. It was not a command either, exactly. It was something stranger than both of those things. It was an invitation from a man who seemed absolutely convinced she would accept it. She should have walked away. She knew that then, and she would know it for years afterward whenever she thought about this moment. She should have asked the barkeep where to find the office of one Thomas Greer, attorney at law, who had written to her about the matter of her late aunt's property. She should have done the sensible, cautious thing. Instead, Susan Hawthorne walked across the sawdust floor of the Silver Creek saloon and sat down in the empty chair. That was how it began. But to understand what it meant, you had to go back 3 months, to a parlor in St. Louis, to a man named Caldwell Pierce, and to the moment Susan first understood that the life she had been promised was nothing more than an elaborate lie. The spring of 1883 had started well enough for Susan. She was 26 years old, educated at the Ursuline Academy, employed as a schoolteacher at the 5th Ward School on Chestnut Street, and engaged to be married to Caldwell Pierce, who was 31 and worked in his father's bank on Market Street. She had thought herself fortunate. She had thought she understood the shape of her future. She had been wrong about both of those things in ways that still made her stomach clench when she allowed herself to think about them too directly. The discovery had been almost comically mundane in its mechanics. She had gone to Caldwell's family home on a Tuesday afternoon to drop off a book she had borrowed from his mother, a volume of verse that Mrs. Pierce Sr. had particularly wanted returned before a visitor arrived that weekend. The housekeeper had shown her into the parlor to wait, and she had waited, and then she had heard voices from the study next door, the door of which was not quite fully closed, and one of those voices had been Caldwell's. "She has no idea," Caldwell was saying, and the pleasure in his voice, the casual, comfortable pleasure of a man discussing something agreeable, made the hair on Susan's arms rise. "Her aunt's land out in Arizona Territory is worth considerably more than she knows. Once we are married, the property transfers. My father's contacts in the Railroad Survey Office confirm the line will run directly through it within 5 years. We will be very comfortable." The other voice, older, harder, had said something Susan could not make out. Caldwell had laughed. "The girl is perfectly agreeable. She will not make difficulties." The girl. She had been standing in his mother's parlor with a book of verse in her hands, and she had been the girl. She had been a transaction. She had been a parcel of land in a territory she had never visited, wearing a face he found agreeable enough to make the arrangement bearable. She had set the book very carefully on the side table. She had walked out of the house without speaking to anyone. She had gone home and sat in her room for the better part of 2 days, eating nothing and sleeping in short, fractured bursts, and then she had done the most practical thing she could think of. She had written to Thomas Greer, her late Aunt Clara's attorney in Redemption, Arizona, and told him she intended to come and see the property herself. Then she had written to Caldwell Pierce and told him the engagement was over, giving no explanation, and she had arranged for a substitute teacher to take her classes for the remainder of the term, and she had packed one bag with everything she genuinely owned, rather than everything she had accumulated in the context of being Caldwell Pierce's future wife, and she had gotten on the stagecoach heading west before the fury that lived behind Caldwell's pleasant eyes had time to find its direction. She had been traveling for nearly 3 weeks by the time she reached Redemption, which sat in a dry valley between two ragged mountain ranges and looked, at first sight, like a town that had started out wanting to be something and had never quite made up its mind what. There was a main street with a general store, a land office, a barber shop, a small church made of adobe, a livery stable, and the Silver Creek Saloon. There were houses scattered behind these buildings, some respectable and some less so. There was a telegraph office that appeared to be closed on Tuesdays for reasons no one had ever adequately explained to Susan's satisfaction. There was, in the far distance, the dark suggestion of mountains against a sky so blue it looked painted, and there was Nelson Boone, sitting at his corner table, watching an empty chair. She sat down across from him on that first afternoon and discovered, over the course of the next 40 minutes, several things about this man. He was 30 years old. He had been born in Tennessee but had come west at the age of 19 and had lived in the Arizona Territory for the better part of a decade. He owned a ranch north of town that ran cattle and some horses and was, by local standards, a going concern rather than a desperate struggle. He was not the kind of man who talked about himself at length or with particular decoration, and so most of these facts emerged slowly, between silences that were not uncomfortable in the way silences with strangers usually were. What she did not discover on that first afternoon was why he had been watching the empty chair, or how long he had been watching it, or what he had imagined would happen when someone finally sat in it. She would not discover any of those things for quite some time. What she did discover was that Nelson Boone had steady hands and careful eyes, and a way of listening to a person that made you feel as though what you were saying was the most important thing happening in the room, which in the Silver Creek Saloon on a Tuesday afternoon was not a high bar to clear, but the sensation was real regardless. She told him she had come about her aunt's property. She did not tell him about Caldwell Pierce. She did not tell him about the railroad survey or the hidden motive that had driven her 900 miles across the country. Those were her secrets to keep, for now. He told her Thomas Greer's office was on the second floor of the building next to the land office, and that Greer kept reasonable hours except on the days he rode out to visit clients on their properties, which could be any day and usually was. He told her the widow Mercer ran the only respectable boarding house in town, 3 blocks east, and that the food was plain but plentiful. He told her the water here was hard and tasted of minerals but was safe to drink. Then he stood up when she stood up, which surprised her, because the men in the saloon around them had not struck her as the standing-up sort, and he said, "I'll walk you to Mrs. Mercer's if you have no objection. It's getting toward dark and Redemption has some rough edges." She had objected on principle because she was not a woman who needed escorting, and she told him so. "I know that," he said, in a tone that suggested he genuinely did know it and was not arguing the point. "I was thinking more about the rough edges than about your capabilities." She had looked at him for a long moment, measuring something she could not quite name, and then she had picked up her bag and walked out of the saloon with Nelson Boone 2 steps behind her, close enough to be present and far enough to make no claim. The widow Mercer was a small, sharp-eyed woman of about 60 who took one look at Susan and told her she had a room available on the second floor with a window that faced east and caught the morning light, and that breakfast was at 7 and supper was at 6, and there would be no gentlemen callers after 8 in the evening. Susan had agreed to all of these terms without hesitation, and had paid 2 weeks in advance from the envelope of money she had withdrawn from her own small savings account before leaving St. Louis. When she turned to thank Nelson Boone for walking her there, he was already halfway down the street, moving with the easy, unhurried stride of a man who had somewhere to be and no particular anxiety about getting there. He did not look back. She had stood on Mrs. Mercer's porch and watched him go and felt something small and unexpected shift in her chest, like a door opening onto a room she had not known was there. She put it aside. She had practical matters to attend to. Thomas Greer turned out to be a thin, fastidious man of about 50, with spectacles that perched perpetually at the end of his nose, and a genuine affection for legal documentation that bordered on the passionate. He received Susan in his office the following morning and spread a series of papers across his desk with the air of a man presenting something precious. Her Aunt Clara's property, he explained, was a parcel of some 460 acres situated 15 miles north of Redemption, in the valley that the locals called Copper Spring Canyon. The land had a spring-fed creek, a modest adobe house that Clara Hawthorne had built and lived in for 22 years, some outbuildings, and a herd of approximately 40 cattle that had been managed by a neighboring rancher named Cole Dunnigan since Clara's death 8 months ago. The land was Susan's outright. Clara had left no other heirs and had been very specific in her wishes. Susan had signed everything Greer put in front of her, asked to have copies of all documents, and then asked, in a careful, neutral voice, whether there had been any inquiries about the property from outside parties. Greer had looked at her over his spectacles. "There have been some inquiries," he said, "from a representative of the Southern Pacific Expansion Office. They sent a man named Aldridge through here in February. Wanted to know if the estate would be selling." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him the estate had a beneficiary and the matter was not yet settled. He left a card." Greer opened a drawer and produced it. He indicated he might return. Susan had taken the card and put it in her pocket without looking at it. She knew exactly what it meant. Caldwell's contacts in the Railroad Survey Office. The trap she had run from had an arm that reached all the way to Arizona Territory, and it had arrived ahead of her. She walked out of Greer's office with a tighter grip on her future than she'd had when she walked in, and the first person she saw on the street below was Nelson Boone, coming out of the general store with a paper-wrapped parcel under his arm and a frown directed at the sky, as though he had been having an argument with the weather. He saw her at almost the same moment she saw him, and the frown rearranged itself into something that was not quite a smile but was in the same general territory. "How did Greer treat you?" he asked. "Professionally," she said. "Do you know everyone in this town?" "Most of them," he said. "It's a small town." "Do you know a man named Aldridge, railroad man?" Something shifted in Nelson's expression. The almost smile went away. "I know of him," he said. "He came through asking about land options in the Canyon Valley." "Why?" "He has been asking about my aunt's property." Nelson was quiet for a moment, looking at her with those careful eyes. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "how much do you know about why the railroad men are interested in Copper Spring Canyon specifically?" "I know enough," she said. "Then you should know that Aldridge does not work alone and he does not take a first refusal gracefully." She looked at him steadily. "Neither do I," she said. For the first time, Nelson Boone smiled at her fully, and it was a surprisingly transformative event. His whole face changed around it, the severity of his features opening up into something genuinely warm, and Susan felt that small internal shift again, stronger this time and harder to dismiss. "No," he said, "I don't imagine you do." She visited the property the following day, borrowing one of Mrs. Mercer's horses and following the directions Greer had provided. The road north was rough but clear, winding through scrub and dust with the mountains blue and solid in the distance, and when she came around the long curve that Greer had described as the entrance to Copper Spring Canyon, she stopped the horse and simply looked. The canyon was not dramatic in the way she had imagined canyons to be. It was not a gorge or a cliff. It was a widening of the land into something generous and sheltered, the walls of rock rising gradually on either side to create a sense of enclosure without oppression. And at the center of it ran the creek that gave the spring its name, a bright thread of water moving over smooth stones between banks lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves turned silver in the afternoon light. The adobe house sat back from the creek on a slight rise, looking weathered but solid. The cattle she could see in the lower pasture were in decent condition. The grass, even in the dry heat, was greener here than anywhere she had passed through. She understood, standing there, why her Aunt Clara had spent 22 years in this place. She also understood, with a clarity that settled into her bones like cool water, that she was going to stay. The hidden motive behind Caldwell Pierce's courtship had given her something he had not intended to give her: a destination. A piece of ground that was genuinely hers, that no one had handed to her as part of an arrangement, that she had done nothing to earn except be the niece of a woman who had been brave enough to come west alone and build something real. She was going to keep it. She rode back to Redemption with her jaw set and her mind already working through logistics, and she nearly ran her horse into Nelson Boone's, because he was coming north on the same road and neither of them had been paying sufficient attention to their surroundings. The horses made their objections known loudly and at length. When the situation had been resolved, Susan and Nelson found themselves facing each other on the narrow road with approximately 4 feet of space between their mounts and the afternoon sun at Nelson's back. "Were you following me?" she asked, because the question needed to be asked. "No," he said, and something in the directness of his answer made her believe him. "I ride out here most days. I have a grazing arrangement with Cole Dunnigan for the north pasture. Cole Dunnigan manages my aunt's cattle." "Yes," Nelson said. "Clara Hawthorne was a neighbor of mine for 8 years. She was a remarkable woman." He paused. "She mentioned you more than once." This surprised Susan. "What did she say?" Nelson tilted his head slightly as though deciding how much to give. "She said you were the one in the family with the backbone to do something interesting with your life, if you ever got tired of being careful." Susan felt the words land somewhere deep and precise, the way something true always lands differently from something merely accurate. Her aunt had known her, had seen her, had written about her to a neighbor in Arizona territory as though she were someone worth mentioning. "She never told me about you," Susan said. "I didn't expect she had," Nelson said. There was something carefully neutral in his expression now, a containment of something that might, in a different moment, be called wistfulness. She kept her worlds separate. They rode back toward Redemption together, not exactly by arrangement, but by the logic of the road having only one direction. And Susan learned more things about Nelson Boone in that hour than she had in the 40 minutes in the saloon. She learned that he had come west originally to escape his own dark past, though he described it in terms so spare and oblique that she could only assemble a rough outline. A family business gone wrong, a disagreement that had cost him more than money, the sense of a younger self he had deliberately left behind in Tennessee and replaced with something he had built himself, stone by stone in the Arizona heat. She recognized the shape of it. She was doing the same thing. By the time they reached the edge of town, Susan had made a decision. She was going to move out to the property within the week. She was going to hire Cole Dunnigan to continue managing the cattle and learn what she could from him about running the land. She was going to rebuild the house where her aunt had lived and make it genuinely livable. And she was going to handle the railroad man named Aldridge when he came back, because he would come back, and she intended to be prepared. She told Nelson her plan as they dismounted at the livery stable, watching his face for the reaction most men of her acquaintance would have given, the polite skepticism, the gentle suggestions about limits, the well-intentioned advice to perhaps consider her options more carefully. Nelson listened without expression until she finished, and then he said, "You'll need to look at the roof on the north side of the house before you move in. Clara had a complaint about it leaking last fall, and I don't know if Dunnigan got to it. Susan looked at him. That is your response. Did you want a different one? She thought about it. No, she said. Actually, no, I did not. The week that followed was the busiest of Susan Hawthorne's life up to that point, and she had been a school teacher in a city school, which was not a restful occupation. She negotiated with Cole Dunnigan, a leathery, quiet man of about 45, who turned out to be deeply knowledgeable about cattle and equally deeply skeptical of women who thought they could run property. And she wore down his skepticism with a combination of genuine questions and absolute refusal to be condescended to that she had perfected in 6 years of teaching 10-year-olds. By the end of their second conversation, Dunnigan had given up trying to manage her expectations and had started actually talking to her about the herd, the land, the creek levels, the seasonal patterns of the canyon, and by the end of the third, she could see the grudging respect beginning to take hold in his eyes. She had the roof repaired. Nelson had been right about the north side. She hired 2 men from town, recommended by Mrs. Mercer as reliable, and supervised the work herself, which meant she was on site at the property every day that week, riding out in the early morning and returning at dusk. The house was solid under its surface disrepair. Clara Hawthorne had built well. The walls were thick, the floors were level, the fireplace drew cleanly, and the windows, though dusty, were intact. Susan scrubbed and organized and aired the place out with the focused intensity of a woman who was not merely cleaning a house, but claiming a life. Nelson rode past on his way to the north pasture every morning and occasionally on his way back in the evenings. He did not stop unless she was visibly occupied with something that required a second pair of hands, and when he did stop, he helped without commentary and left without expectation. She found this so contrary to her experience of men in general that she spent more time than was probably reasonable thinking about it. On the 5th day, he brought her a piece of information instead of labor. He tied his horse at her fence and came to find her in the outbuilding where she was taking inventory of her aunt's tools, and the expression on his face told her before he spoke that something had happened that she would not like. "Aldridge is back," Nelson said. "He rode in this morning with 2 other men. They've taken rooms at the saloon." Susan set down the harness she had been examining and wiped her hands on her work apron. "Does he know I'm here?" Greer would have told him. "It's public record that the property transferred." She thought for a moment. "What does he want specifically?" "Right of way through the canyon. The whole parcel if he can get it. The survey line runs directly through the center of the property where the creek is. They need the water access as much as the land. A railroad depot needs water and Copper Spring Creek is reliable year-round." He paused. "He'll make you an offer first. That's the method. Reasonable offer, then pressure, then something less reasonable. There are people in this territory who have been forced off their land by railroad interests. I've seen it happen." The word forced settled in Susan's chest like a stone. She had been forced out of one life already by men who thought her agreeable and manageable. She was not going to let it happen again. "What kind of pressure?" she asked. Nelson was quiet for a moment and she could see him measuring something, deciding how honest to be. "Legal pressure mostly, challenges to the deed, delays in the land office, but Aldridge's associates are not always careful about staying within the legal register." He met her eyes directly. "You are alone out here, Miss Hawthorne. I'm not saying you can't manage. I'm saying it's a fact that affects strategy." She appreciated that he said it without decoration. It was a fact. She was alone. The question was what to do with that fact. Would Cole Dunnigan stand with me if it came to a formal dispute? He might. He has his own interests in maintaining the grazing arrangements, but Dunnigan is a careful man. He will not put himself directly in Aldridge's path. Would you? The question came out more simply than she had intended, and she watched Nelson's face absorb it, the slight stillness that passed through him before he answered. "Yes," he said, "I would." She held that for a moment, turning it over. "Why?" "Because Clara Hawthorne was a good neighbor and a good woman, and this land was her life's work, and you are her kin." He paused again, and something else moved across his face, something that was not about Clara at all. And because I have been watching this canyon valley for 8 years, and I know what it is worth, and it is not worth the kind of man Aldridge represents. It was not a declaration. It was a statement of principle, carefully contained, and yet Susan felt it in the same place she had felt his almost smile in front of Greer's office, in the small room inside herself that she had not known existed before she sat down in that empty chair. "All right," she said. "Then I need to talk to Greer again, and I need to understand exactly what rights I have and what protections exist in the territory's land law, and I need to do it before Aldridge comes to call." "He'll come tomorrow," Nelson said. "If I know his type, he'll give you one night to think about his presence, and then he'll come in the morning with his offer." He was correct. Aldridge arrived at 10 in the morning on a fine, clear Thursday in May of 1883, riding a good horse and wearing a suit that had been made east of the Mississippi. He was about 45, with a salesman's confidence and the particular kind of smile that had never quite learned to reach the eyes. He had one of his men with him, staying back at the fence, and he came up to the porch where Susan was waiting with her coffee and what she hoped was an expression of polite vacancy. He introduced himself. He told her how sorry he was about the loss of her aunt. He complimented the property. He expressed the railroad's admiration for the independent women of the Western Territories. Then he named a figure. It was a reasonable figure. In fact, it was a generous figure for land in this part of the territory. That was the point. Susan understood. The first offer was always generous, because its purpose was to establish that the man making it was reasonable, which made any subsequent refusal look like intransigence on the seller's part. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Aldridge," Susan said, in the pleasant, attentive tone she had developed over years of managing parents who disagreed with her teaching methods. "I'll need to think about it." "Of course," he said with a smile. "Take all the time you need." "I believe I'll take about 30 years," she said. "I'm planning to be here for quite some time." The smile did not disappear, but it changed texture. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "I want to be candid with you. This property is in the path of progress. The railroad's arrival in this valley is a matter of when, not if. The question is whether you benefit from that arrival or are simply reorganized around it." "I'm not familiar with that particular kind of reorganization," she said, "but I imagine it involves a great deal of paperwork." "Among other things," he said, and now the smile was entirely gone. After he left, Susan went inside and sat down at her aunt's kitchen table and let herself feel, for exactly 5 minutes, the full weight of what she was doing. She was a schoolteacher from St. Louis with one bag of personal belongings, a property she had owned for 6 days, and a railroad company with significant political connections, and a demonstrated history of getting what it wanted from the small landholders of the Western Territories. Then the 5 minutes were up, and she stood up and went to write the first of several letters. One to Greer, asking him to research precedents for protecting private land rights against railroad eminent domain claims in the Arizona Territory. One to a lawyer in Tucson whose name she had found in one of Clara's files, a woman lawyer, which was unusual enough to suggest she might be the kind of person worth consulting. And one to a journalist at the Tucson Citizen newspaper, because Susan had been a teacher long enough to know that public attention was sometimes the most effective lever available to a person without institutional power. She was sealing the envelopes when she heard a horse at the fence, and she did not need to look up to know who it was. "How did it go?" Nelson asked from the doorway. "He offered me a generous price and implied that refusing would have consequences." "That's the script," Nelson said. He came in and sat down across from her at the table, the same configuration as the saloon, the same quiet directness in his posture, and Susan felt something rearrange itself inside her chest, something that was less like a door opening and more like a key turning. "I've written some letters," she said. "I'd like to ride to town and send them this afternoon." "I'll go with you," he said. You don't have to." "I know that," he said, in exactly the tone he had used on the first evening when he walked her to Mrs. Mercer's boarding house, the tone that made clear he was not arguing about her capabilities. And she had the same response she had then. She picked up her letters and her hat and walked out to saddle her horse, and Nelson Boone came with her. The weeks that followed built themselves into a shape that surprised Susan with its warmth. She had come to Arizona territory in a state of controlled grief, mourning the life she had almost been tricked into living, and she had expected to spend her first months here in a similar state of control, managing and strategizing and defending. She had not expected the days to become something she looked forward to rather than simply navigated. Cole Dunnigan's skepticism had curdled fully into respect, and then into something resembling admiration by the end of the first month. He taught her the rhythms of the canyon land with the patience of a man who had come to understand that she was genuinely paying attention, and she learned to read the creek levels and the cattle's condition and the weather patterns that came across the mountains in the late afternoon with enough regularity to be relied upon. She learned that the spring in Copper Spring Canyon had never run dry in the 40-odd years that anyone in the territory had been keeping records, which meant the land's value was real and durable and not dependent on the railroad for its existence. She repaired the fence lines on the east boundary with her own hands because it needed doing, and because doing physical work had a clarity to it that thinking sometimes lacked. She found in her aunt's papers a correspondence with a botanist in New Mexico who had been interested in the unusual range of desert plants in the canyon, and she wrote to him and discovered a potential secondary source of income in the cultivation and sale of specific medicinal plants that grew well in the canyon's particular combination of shade and minerals. She was not building a defensive position. She was building a life. Nelson came by most days, not always for long. Not always for any particular reason he named explicitly, but consistently, reliably, in a way that she had stopped pretending was casual or coincidental. He fixed things without being asked. He shared information about the territory, its politics, its people, its patterns, with the authority of a man who had paid attention for years. He argued with her sometimes, carefully, when he thought she was wrong about something, and she found she valued those arguments more than she had expected to value any disagreement, because they were arguments between two people who respected each other's capacity to be right. She was sitting on her porch one evening in late June, the air finally cooling after the brutality of the afternoon sun, when she asked him the question she had been holding back for 2 months. "That first day in the saloon," she said. "How long had you been watching the empty chair before I walked in?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might choose not to answer. Then he said, 6 months. She looked at him. 6 months. "After Clara died," he said, in the careful, spare way he had of discussing things that mattered to him. "I had been eating supper at that saloon most evenings. Clara used to come in sometimes on her supply days and she would sit there. We would talk. And then she was gone and the chair stayed empty and I kept sitting in the same place." He paused. "I don't entirely know what I was watching for, except that it felt like something was supposed to happen, eventually, to account for the empty space." Susan thought about that for a long moment. She thought about Aunt Clara, who had apparently seen something in her niece worth mentioning to her neighbor. She thought about the particular mechanics of grief, the way it attached itself to ordinary objects and made them freighted with meaning. She thought about herself walking through the door of the Silver Creek Saloon on a dusty afternoon with a travel bag and a broken engagement and a secret, and a man with dark eyes saying, with complete certainty, that the empty chair belonged to her. "You couldn't have known it would be me," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it was." The thing between them was not spoken of directly for another month, because both Susan and Nelson were people who had been burned by what happened when you moved too fast toward something you wanted, and because the summer in the canyon was full of urgency that had nothing to do with personal feelings. Aldridge had not left. He had settled into the Silver Creek Saloon with the patient, calculated permanence of a man who was on the company's time and salary, and could afford to wait longer than any individual with a mortgage or a payroll to meet. He made 2 more visits to Susan's property, each one slightly less pleasant than the last, and each one met with the same polite firmness that she had developed into something approaching an art form. His 3rd visit in early July had a different quality. He brought both of his men with him, and while he himself maintained his salesman's manner, the men positioned themselves in a way that was designed to be noticed, their presence a physical suggestion of what disagreement might ultimately cost. Susan noticed it. She said nothing about it in the moment, except to tell Aldridge that her answer remained unchanged and that she was busy. But that evening she told Nelson what had happened, and she watched his jaw set in a way she had not seen before. "He's escalating," Nelson said. "He's moving to the phase where he demonstrates that your inconvenience is costing you comfort." "I'm aware," she said. "I've sent the letters and received some responses. The lawyer in Tucson, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, has agreed to take my case on a contingency basis. She says there are legal precedents in the territory for resisting eminent domain claims when the land is actively worked by its owner, particularly when no formal survey condemnation has been filed." Nelson nodded slowly. "That's solid." The journalist at the Tucson Citizen is interested in the story. He says there are 3 other landholders in the territory who have been pressured by the same railroad interests in the past year, and 2 of them eventually sold against their will. He wants to write about it. Aldridge will not like that. "No," Susan said. "He will not." She could see Nelson working through something, weighing something, and she waited for him to arrive at whatever he was going to say. "Miss Hawthorne," he said finally, and then stopped, and she saw him make a decision about something. "Susan," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name without her permission, which was both a mild social impropriety and, she noticed, a relief. "I want to be more directly useful to you in this, and I want you to know that my interest in being useful is not entirely detached from a personal interest in your presence continuing in this canyon." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of everything in that moment with unusual clarity. The cooling air, the sound of the creek below the house, the last light going out of the sky over the western ridge, the expression on Nelson Boone's face, which was that of a man who had decided to stop being careful about a particular thing. "Is that what you want to tell me?" she said. "It's the beginning of it," he said. "All right," she said. "Tell me the rest." What he told her was that he had known, from the moment she sat down in that chair in the saloon, that something had shifted in him that he had not been expecting and was not sure he wanted to have happen. He told her that he had subsequently spent considerable effort convincing himself that his interest in her situation was purely neighborly, and that whatever else he might be feeling was not his business to act on when she was in the middle of navigating a crisis. He told her that he was not a man who rushed toward things without looking at them carefully, because the dark past he had referred to obliquely on their first ride together had included a serious mistake that had cost himself and several other people considerably, and he had spent 10 years being deliberately cautious about every significant thing in his life. He told her that being cautious about her had been getting harder every day for approximately 2 months. Susan listened to all of this without interrupting, which took a significant exercise of will because she had opinions about most of it and wanted to share them. When he stopped talking, she said, "What was the mistake?" He looked at her with some surprise. "The dark past," she said. "You've referred to it in fragments twice now, and I think I'd rather know the actual thing than keep assembling the outline from hints." So he told her. He had been 21 in Tennessee, working in his family's small freight business. There had been a partner his father trusted who had not been trustworthy, and who had been using the freight business to move goods of a kind that were illegal, and Nelson had known about it for 2 months before he told anyone, because he had been afraid of what the knowledge would cost his family. In those 2 months, The situation had grown into something that, when it finally broke open, had cost his father the business, his older brother a year in prison on a charge that was partially deserved, and his family the house they had lived in since before Nelson was born. The partner had largely escaped consequence. Nelson had not forgiven himself for the 2 months of silence, even though he had been young and frightened, and the choice to say nothing had come from love rather than cowardice. He had come west to be someone who did not make that kind of choice again. Someone who spoke when speaking was needed, and acted when acting was called for, and did not let fear of cost delay the right thing past the point where the right thing could still help. "That is why you said yes when I asked if you would stand with me against Aldridge," Susan said, without hesitating. "Yes," he said, "and because it was the right thing regardless." "Both can be true," she said. "Your past does not make your present dishonest." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that with the same careful attention he gave to everything she said. "There is something I have not told you," Susan said, because it was her turn. "About why I came here." She told him about Caldwell Pierce, all of it. The engagement, the parlor, the overheard conversation, the railroad contacts, the phrase "the girl" spoken in the voice of a man describing a transaction. She told him about walking out of the house with a book of verse on the side table and spending 2 days in her room, and then choosing to come to something real rather than run from something false. Nelson was very still while she talked. When she finished, he said, with a quietness that held something heated underneath it, "He planned to use you to take this land." "Yes, and he never knew you'd heard him." "No, I gave him no explanation when I ended the engagement. I thought it was cleaner that way. He couldn't argue with silence the way he could argue with an accusation. He might come looking for an explanation eventually." "He might," Susan agreed. "But he will find that the land is mine and it stays mine. And there is a lawyer in Tucson and a journalist in Tucson and a neighbor who will stand with me. And I think Caldwell Pierce will calculate the cost of the argument and decide it is not worth his time." Nelson looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was frank admiration, and it sat alongside something warmer and more personal, and he made no effort to moderate either of those things. "Can I say something plainly?" he asked. "I would prefer that you always do," she said. "I am in considerable danger of falling in love with you," he said. "And I want to know if that is something you have any interest in, or if it is information you would prefer I kept to myself for the time being." Susan looked at the last light on the western ridge, and at the creek moving silver in the dimness, and at Nelson Boone's face, which was the face of a man who had stopped being careful about this one thing. "It is not information I would prefer you kept to yourself," she said. The rest of that evening was the most honest conversation Susan had had with anyone since before she could remember, perhaps since her aunt had been alive, because her aunt had been the only other person in her life who had seemed interested in what Susan actually thought rather than what was appropriate for her to think. They talked about what they wanted, which was a novel experience for both of them, having grown up in contexts where wanting was a thing you managed rather than expressed. Nelson wanted the ranch to be something he could be proud of and something that could be sustained across time. Susan wanted the canyon land and the life her aunt had built there and the freedom to make her own decisions about both. They talked about the differences between those things and the overlaps between them, and the overlaps were significant, and neither of them pretended otherwise. When he left that night, he took her hand briefly at the porch steps, not in a romantic gesture exactly but in the way of two people acknowledging an agreement, and she watched him ride north toward his own property with the feeling that something had finally been decided that had been undecided for a very long time, longer possibly than she had been in Arizona at all. August brought the resolution of several things at once, which was appropriate since August in the Arizona territory was the kind of month that did not allow for subtlety. Alina Marsh arrived from Tucson on the 15th, a woman of about 38 with the brisk, undecorated efficiency of someone who had spent years insisting on being taken seriously in rooms that did not initially wish to take her seriously. She reviewed Susan's deed, the land survey documents, the record of Aldridge's visits, and the existing precedents in territory land law, and told Susan with professional confidence that Aldridge's company had not filed a condemnation claim through the proper territory channels, which meant all of his pressure was theater rather than legal process. "They are hoping you will sell voluntarily before they have to go through the courts," Marsh said. "The courts are slow and expensive for them too, and there is no guarantee they would win. The spring water rights in particular are contestable under the 1877 Desert Land Act provisions." "What do I need to do?" Susan asked. "File a formal notice of active land use and occupancy with the Territory Land Office in Tucson. It creates a legal record that complicates any future condemnation proceeding. Then continue to work and inhabit the property. The law favors the working owner." Susan filed the notice within the week, riding to Tucson with Nelson and staying 2 nights while the paperwork was processed. It was their first time away from the canyon together, and it had an odd, clarifying quality to it. Tucson was a different scale of existence than Redemption, with more noise and more people, and more of the push and pull of territorial politics, and they moved through it comfortably together, negotiating decisions about where to eat and when to sleep, and what business to attend to in what order with a naturalness that suggested they had been doing it for longer than they had. On the second evening, walking back to the hotel from the restaurant, Nelson stopped on the street with what Susan had come to recognize as his decision-making expression, the slight stillness, the careful choosing of words. "I've been thinking," he said. "I can see that," she said. "About the practical arrangement of things," he said. "Your land and mine are 4 miles apart. The grazing arrangements between the 2 properties already make them functionally related. If they were formally related, it would strengthen the legal standing of both, and there would be fewer logistics." Susan stopped walking. "That is," she said, "possibly the least romantic proposal I have ever heard." He looked at her with an expression that was fighting with itself between seriousness and amusement, and the amusement was winning. "I hadn't gotten to the romantic part yet," he said. "I was building the foundation." "Nelson," she said. "Yes. Are you trying to propose to me by way of practical land management?" "I was attempting to approach it from a position of logical utility, before declaring that the logical utility is, in point of fact, secondary to the fact that I want to spend my life in a world that has you in it, and I would prefer for you to be specifically in my part of it on a permanent basis." He paused. "That was the romantic part." Susan looked at him for a long moment on the busy Tucson street with the evening crowd moving around them, and she felt everything she had been feeling for the past 3 months arrive at its conclusion simultaneously, which was a great deal to feel on a public thoroughfare but apparently unavoidable. "Yes," she said, "to both the practical and the romantic parts." He smiled at her then, the full transformative smile she had first seen outside Greer's office, and he took her hand properly this time, not the acknowledgement of an agreement gesture but a real and deliberate claiming, and she leaned into him slightly, and it was as simple and as enormous as that. They were married in the first week of September, in the small adobe church in Redemption, by a minister who came through the territory every 6 weeks and happened to be due. Mrs. Mercer attended and cried pleasantly throughout the ceremony. Cole Dunnigan attended and did not cry, but shook Nelson's hand afterward with the grip of a man who approved. Thomas Greer attended and brought a very fine bottle of wine from somewhere mysterious. Eleanor Marsh sent a letter of congratulations from Tucson that managed to be warm and professionally congratulatory simultaneously. Half the town attended, because Redemption was a small place and a wedding was an occasion. The ceremony itself was simple and the words were real. Susan had not wanted elaborate promises she might later have to account for against complicated reality. She wanted honest ones, the kind that acknowledged difficulty alongside joy, the kind that held. "With everything I have and everything I will become," Nelson said, in front of the minister and the assembled witnesses and God if God was paying attention, "I choose you." She had not expected to cry. She cried. They rode home to the canyon together in the early afternoon, and the canyon was full of late summer light and the sound of the creek and the particular silence that had become, over the course of the summer, the sound of belonging. The matter of Aldridge resolved itself, as Susan had predicted, through the arithmetic of cost and benefit. The journalist's article in the Tucson Citizen ran in October, and it named the company and described the pattern of pressure applied to multiple landholders in the territory, and it quoted Eleanor Marsh on the legal vulnerabilities of the railroad's approach, and it quoted Susan Hawthorne Boone on the specific details of Aldridge's visits. The company's public relations office was not pleased. The territory delegate's office received several inquiries. The Southern Pacific's regional manager, a man with more political caution than Aldridge possessed, decided that Copper Spring Canyon was not worth the ongoing complication and redirected the survey line 4 miles to the south, where the terrain was less valuable and the landholders more willing to sell. Aldridge left Redemption on a Tuesday in November without a word to anyone, which was its own kind of statement. Susan had watched his horse disappear down the main street from the window of the general store where she was picking up supplies, and she had felt a settling of something that had been tense for months, a long exhalation, a final release of the vigilance she had been maintaining since before she ever boarded the stagecoach west. The trap Caldwell Pierce had built around her had not caught her. It had, in the most useful possible inversion of his intentions, sent her here, to the canyon, to this life. To a corner table in a saloon where a man with dark eyes had been watching an empty chair and had recognized, with a certainty she still found remarkable, that it belonged to her. She wrote to her mother in St. Louis, with whom she had a complicated and guarded relationship, and told her she was well and married and living on her own land in the Arizona territory. Her mother's response was predictable in its concern and unpredictable in its eventual warmth. She wrote that she did not entirely understand the choices Susan had made, but that Susan had always been the one in the family with a sense of direction, which was the closest her mother had ever come to saying that she admired her daughter, and Susan accepted it in that spirit and wrote back affectionately. She did not write to Caldwell Pierce. There was nothing to say to him, and the land spoke for itself. The first winter in the canyon was harder than Susan had anticipated and more beautiful than she had imagined. The Arizona territory did get cold in the mountains, cold enough to frost the creek edges in the mornings and keep the cattle closer to the sheltered pasture, and she learned the practical rhythms of a working ranch in winter with the same focused attention she had brought to everything else. Nelson was a good teacher, not because he was patient with ignorance, but because he had no contempt for it, and he showed her things with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who understood that knowledge was not a mark of superiority, but simply a thing you passed forward. They worked well together. She had not been entirely certain they would, because she had strong opinions and so did he, and they did not always arrive at agreement by the most direct route. But their disagreements had a productive quality, the kind that arrived at better solutions than either person's initial position had contained. She kept the books for both properties and discovered she had a facility for numbers she had not previously exercised. He managed the cattle and the horses with an expertise that she could observe and learn from, but had no illusions about matching in the near term. Cole Dunnigan stayed on and eventually stopped prefacing his suggestions with the particular note of caution he used to use when directing them to Susan rather than Nelson, which she took as a meaningful marker of change. By the spring of 1884, the canyon land was genuinely thriving. The medicinal plant arrangement she had developed with the New Mexico botanist was bringing in a supplementary income that covered most of the supply costs for the year. The cattle herd was healthier than it had been in the 2 years before Clara's death. The house was warm and livable and increasingly marked with the evidence of two people making a life in it. Books and tools and practical things arranged in patterns that made sense to both of them. And in May of 1884, on a morning when the creek was running particularly clear, and the light in the canyon had the liquid quality it sometimes got in the spring, Susan told Nelson that she was expecting a child. He had been at the kitchen table drinking coffee and reading a letter from a man in New Mexico about a possible breeding arrangement for one of his mares, and he looked up from the letter and looked at her face and put the letter down very carefully and said nothing for a moment, which was not the response she had expected. "Nelson," she said. "I'm taking that in," he said, which was so exactly like him that she laughed, and the laughter broke whatever tension had been gathering in the room, and he stood up and came to her and held her in the way he had of holding her when something mattered enough to need the full weight of presence, both arms around her back and his chin against her hair. "A child," he said quietly into her hair. "In November, I think," she said. "A child," he said again, as though he was still assembling the reality of it. Their son was born on the 4th of November, 1884, at the property in Copper Spring Canyon, attended by Mrs. Mercer, who turned out to have delivered a significant number of babies during her years in the territory, and was brisk and competent, and reassuring throughout a process that Susan experienced as both the hardest and the most significant thing she had ever done. Nelson stayed close enough to be immediately available and far enough not to be in the way of what was actually happening, which was a reasonable spatial arrangement that Mrs. Mercer endorsed and Susan was grateful for. The baby was healthy and loud about it, which Mrs. Mercer said was the best possible quality in a newborn. He had a dark tuft of hair and very small hands, and an expression of profound indignation at the general state of existence that Nelson said reminded him of Susan when she was confronting a problem she hadn't expected. "That is not a compliment," Susan said, still very tired and very happy, and holding the small, indignant person against her chest. "It is absolutely a compliment," Nelson said, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at both of them with an expression she had no word for, something that was past love and past gratitude and past wonder and was all of those things simultaneously. "It means he already knows things aren't acceptable the way they are, and something should be done about them." They named him James, for no family reason particularly, but because it was a name that stood on its own without needing anything attached to it, which seemed right for a person who had arrived with such evident self-sufficiency. James Boone grew through his first year, with the same focused intensity he had brought to his entrance into the world. Sitting up and then pulling himself along the floor, and then standing against the furniture with a determination that made his parents laugh, and then catching his breath for a series of steps across the kitchen floor at 10 months while Susan stood at the counter, and turned just in time to see it happen, and Nelson was not there, but she told him that evening with her hands moving as she described it, and he listened to every word. The canyon was a good place to grow up, she thought. She was already thinking of it in those terms, as a place for growing into rather than out of, which was the opposite of how she had thought of St. Louis by the end. In 1886, a drought came to the territory that tested every rancher within 100 miles of redemption. The creek held, which was a significant advantage. The spring that fed it went as deep as anyone could measure and showed no signs of diminishing, which was the proof, if any more were needed, of what the land was genuinely worth. They managed the herd carefully that year, selling a third of the cattle in spring before the worst of the dry season, rather than losing animals to thirst and poor grazing in the summer, a decision that felt harsh in the making and proved wise in retrospect. Cole Dunnigan's knowledge of the land's patterns was invaluable, and Susan made sure he knew she valued it, which he received in the way practical men receive genuine appreciation, by working harder. Nelson's ranch north of the canyon had a more difficult time of the drought. the natural spring there being smaller and less reliable, and they discussed the question of formally combining the operations during the summer of 1886. The conversation had a different quality than the Tucson proposal, because they had 2 years of actually managing the practical details behind them, and they approached it with all the evidence available rather than all the hope, which produced a more robust agreement, and one they could both rely on. They built a new structure on the canyon property, larger than Clara's original house, incorporating the existing adobe walls into something that had room for more people than currently lived in it. Nelson sold the original ranch house north of the property line and put the money into improvements on the canyon land that would serve both operations. The day the last wall of the new addition was finished, they stood in the expanded kitchen together, and Susan looked at the room, which was twice the size of what she had moved into 3 years ago and already somehow full of the evidence of the life they had built in it, and she said, "Aunt Clara would have liked this." "Yes," Nelson said. "She would have wanted to inspect every joint in the construction and tell me 2 things I could have done better." "She would have been right about both of them," Susan said. He smiled and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and there was nothing that needed to be said after that. James was 3 when his sister was born, in the early summer of 1887, arriving with considerably less drama than her brother, but no less presence. They named her Clara, because it was right, and because there was a debt of gratitude that naming could not fully pay but that naming acknowledged. Clara Boone grew to look more like her father, with his dark eyes and his quality of stillness, though she had her mother's precision of manner and her mother's interest in getting to the bottom of whatever question was currently in front of her. James and Clara grew up in the canyon, the way their mother had sometimes imagined growing up, with space and purpose and the clear evidence all around them that work was not a burden but a structure, the frame on which a life was built. They learned the creek and the cattle and the land's rhythms as easily as they learned their letters, because both were equally present and equally valued. Susan ran a small school at the house 2 afternoons a week for 5 years, teaching the canyon children whose parents had no other access to education, because she was a teacher, and the fact of having become a rancher's wife did not make her less so, and Nelson had never for a single day suggested that it should. The school grew enough that by 1890 the town of Redemption had established a proper schoolhouse and hired a formal teacher, and Susan had assisted in that process from beginning to end, and attended the opening day with the particular satisfaction of a person who has seen something through from nothing to completion. In 1888, Caldwell Pierce appeared, not in person. His presence came in the form of a letter, forwarded from St. Louis through her mother, written in the precise, controlled handwriting she remembered from his correspondence during their engagement. He had heard she had married and settled in the territory. He wanted her to know that he had no ill feelings about the termination of their arrangement and that he wished her well. He expressed admiration for her independence of spirit. He said nothing about the railroad or the land or the overheard conversation in his father's study. He was, Susan understood, closing an account, making sure there was nothing outstanding between them that might later become complicated. It was a business letter disguised as a personal one, which was exactly the kind of letter Caldwell Pierce would write. She showed it to Nelson, who read it with his characteristic stillness and then set it down on the table. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "He is not relevant." "Do you want to write back?" She considered it for a moment. "I don't think so. There is nothing to say to him. The life he intended to take from me is the life I am living. It seems excessive to explain that to him." Nelson folded the letter and handed it back to her, and she put it in the stove, and that was the end of Caldwell Pierce. The summer of 1890 brought a different kind of test, quieter than the railroad man or the drought, but in some ways more intimate. Nelson's older brother William arrived in Redemption in July, released 2 years early from prison on good behavior, thin and wary and visibly uncertain of his welcome. The brother whose year in prison Nelson had spent a decade carrying guilt over had served his full sentence, and now stood at the edge of their property on a Wednesday afternoon, while Nelson stood on the porch, and they looked at each other across the kind of distance that is not measured in feet. Susan had watched from the kitchen window, giving them space, and then she had gone out onto the porch because she could see that Nelson was not going to close that distance by himself and William was not going to presume to do it either, and someone needed to move. "You must be William," she said, walking to the fence. "I'm Susan. Please come in." He looked at her with surprise that had something grateful underneath it, and he came in, and she made coffee, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table in the Canyon house that had been Clara Hawthorne's and was now hers and Nelson's, and the conversation was difficult and then less difficult, and then something that was past difficulty entirely. William stayed. Not on the property but in redemption, working first at the livery stable and then, as the town grew, at the new freight office that opened in 1891. He was a capable man who had been through something hard and come out of it still recognizably himself, and the relationship he built with Nelson over the years that followed was not the same as what they had been before the family business collapsed, but it was real and solid, and something both of them had made a choice toward, which was perhaps better than what it replaced. Nelson and Susan went to Tucson in the fall of 1891 to attend a territorial land rights conference, where Eleanor Marsh was presenting a paper on the legal developments of the past decade, and they stayed 3 days and celebrated their 8th anniversary at a restaurant considerably finer than the one they had been to during the filing trip in 1883. At the table, over a meal that was better than anything available within 60 miles of Redemption, Nelson looked at her across the white tablecloth and the good silver and said, with the directness he had never lost, "I want you to know that I am aware, every day, of what it means that you sat down in that chair." She looked at him. His face was the face she knew best in the world now, better than she knew her own in the mirror, the lines around the eyes that hadn't been there in 1883, the gray beginning to come at his temples, the steady quality of his attention that had never once wavered in 8 years. "Tell me what it means," she said, because she wanted to hear it in his words. "It means I have a life that is genuinely mine," he said. "Not recovered from something or built in compensation for something, but genuinely, freely mine. Because of you. Because of the choice you made to stay and the choice you made to trust me and the choice you made every day since." She felt the back of her eyes sting, which was not her typical response to restaurant dinners but was apparently unavoidable tonight. "Nelson," she said. "Yes." "The chair," she said. "It was always going to be mine. I think we both understood that even before we had the words for it." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she thought about a corner table in a dusty saloon in 1883, and a man watching an empty space in the world where something was supposed to come, and the improbable, extraordinary miracle of the fact that what came was her. They went home to the canyon on the 3rd day, the road familiar under the horses' feet, the mountains unchanging and the sky its impossible blue, and when they came around the curve and the canyon opened up before them with the creek catching the light and the house sitting solid on its rise and the cottonwoods moving silver in the late afternoon air, Susan felt the same thing she had felt the first time she saw it, that settling, that recognition. That sense of ground beneath her feet that was real and hers and permanent. James met them at the fence, 7 years old and full of information about a situation involving the East pasture cattle that apparently required immediate attention. Clara was on the porch, which was where she frequently was when she was thinking, watching the canyon with her father's quiet attention. The cattle situation was resolved by suppertime. The evening was cool and quiet and full of the small satisfactions of a day completed. The children went asleep, and the house settled around them, and Susan and Nelson sat on the porch in the dark in a companionable silence that had years of weight to it and was the better for every year. "Are you happy?" She asked not because she doubted it, but because she liked to hear him answer. "Entirely," he said. "Are you?" She looked at the creek in the darkness, hearing it more than seeing it, the sound of water over stones that had been running in this canyon for longer than anyone could account for. "I walked into a saloon in May of 1883, she said, "with a broken engagement and a secret and a travel bag and not much else, and you told me an empty chair belonged to me." She paused. "Yes, Nelson, I am entirely happy." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the night was full of stars, more stars than any sky she had known before coming to this place. The kind of stars that make the world feel both very small and very large simultaneously, and they stayed there for a long while, which was exactly the right thing to do. In the years that followed, redemption grew as the territory grew, the addition of statehood in 1912 being something Susan and Nelson both lived to see, walking together into the small ceremony at the Redemption Town Hall, their hair gray now and their hands clasped, the children grown and the grandchildren beginning to appear in various parts of the expanding world. James had gone east to study engineering and had come back west to work on bridge construction in California, married to a woman from Sacramento who had her grandmother's directness and her grandfather's patience, which was a combination Susan and Nelson agreed privately was ideal. Their first grandchild, a boy, was born in 1910 and named Thomas after no one in particular, just because it suited him. Clara had stayed closest to the canyon, working first as a teacher as her mother had, then as the first female member of the Redemption Town Council in 1908, which was a distinction she received with the matter-of-fact quality she had inherited from both parents, and which was an entirely accurate response to an entirely appropriate development. She married in 1909, a man named Robert who was a mining surveyor and who had the good sense to recognize that in marrying Clara Boone, he was marrying into a particular kind of family, one where people said what they meant and did what they said and stood with each other regardless of cost, and who was grateful for it. Cole Dunnigan retired in 1905, old and a bit slow and deeply satisfied with his work, and at the party Susan and Nelson threw for him at the Canyon House, he made a speech that was mostly about cattle and secondarily about the fact that he had been wrong about women ranchers in 1883 and had learned better, which was the closest he had ever come to a direct personal admission and was received accordingly. Eleanor Marsh had become a judge by 1900, one of the first women to hold that office in the territory, and she and Susan had maintained a correspondence for nearly 30 years, a professional friendship that was also a genuine one, the kind that is built on mutual respect and sharpens both parties over time. Thomas Greer had died in 1897, of old age and the satisfaction of a life spent in useful paperwork, and Susan had attended his funeral and meant the grief she felt, because he had treated her with professional honesty from the first day, and that was not a thing she took lightly. William Boone had become, over the 20-odd years he spent in Redemption, a fixture of the town, known for his reliability and his quiet decency, and the way he showed up when things needed to be done. He never married, but he was not lonely. He was a beloved uncle to James and Clara and a fixed point in Nelson's life that had healed something old and important. The Canyon land was, in 1915, what Clara Hawthorne had started it as, a going concern, a piece of ground genuinely worked and genuinely cared for, the creek still running clear and the springs still reliable, and the cattle thriving in the valley's sheltered pasture. The Southern Pacific Line had come through 4 miles to the south, as the redirected survey had specified, and the town of Copper Station had grown up along it, visible from the eastern ridge on clear days as a smudge of smoke and activity, close enough to affect regional commerce and distant enough to leave the canyon's particular quality intact. Susan was 60 years old in 1917, which was a fact she regarded with equanimity, because 60 was not old the way it had seemed old when she was 26, and because she had done enough with the years between those numbers to not feel cheated by any arithmetic. Her hair was fully silver now, and she wore it pinned simply, and she moved through the canyon house with the ease of a person in the right place, which she was. Nelson was 61, and the years had given him a gravity that suited the steadiness he had always possessed, and his dark eyes were clear and direct as they had ever been. And when he looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning with his coffee and his newspaper, it was with the same quality of attention he had brought to looking at an empty chair in a saloon in 1883. The certainty of someone who knows what they are looking at is exactly what it should be. On the morning of their 32nd anniversary, he brought her coffee before she was fully awake, as he had done more mornings than not for 3 decades, and sat on the edge of the bed with his own cup, and she sat up against the pillows and accepted hers, and they looked out the east-facing window at the light coming into the canyon in the particular way it did in September, bright and angled and full of meaning. "I have been thinking," she said, which was how she often started the conversations that mattered. "Tell me," he said, which was how he always answered. "About the chair," she said. "I have been thinking about what you must have felt, all those months, watching something empty and not knowing what you were watching for." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was genuinely considering the question rather than reaching for an easy answer. "Hope," he said finally. "I think that is what it was. I did not know to call it that at the time, but that was what I was keeping alive by watching that empty space. The possibility that what was missing could be filled." She looked at him over her coffee cup, at this man she had been married to for 32 years, who had walked her to a boarding house on her first night in a strange town and fixed a leaking roof, and stood with her against a railroad company, and held her hand in Tucson, and held her through everything that had come after. "It was always going to be filled," she said. "Everything that was meant to reach its place eventually gets there." "It took you a while," he said, with the almost smile she had never stopped finding transformative. "I had some things to resolve first," she said, "some traps to escape, some secrets to carry and put down." "You managed it," he said. "We managed it," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, which was a thing he did and had always done, and which never became ordinary despite the repetition, because something can only become ordinary if you stop paying attention to it, and he never had. Outside the window, the canyon was filling with morning. The creek was running. The cottonwoods were turning, just beginning the gold that would be complete by October. The cattle in the lower pasture were moving in their unhurried morning patterns, and somewhere in the distance a hawk was making slow circles over the ridgeline, riding the air with the absolute confidence of a creature in exactly the right place. Susan Hawthorne Boone drank her coffee and watched the morning come into the canyon that had been hers for 34 years, the canyon she had come to in flight from a trap and had stayed in by choice, freely and fully, and with her whole self. She had sat down in an empty chair, and it had been the right chair, and that was the whole story, and it was the best story she knew. The sun came fully over the eastern ridge, and the canyon filled with light, and the day began the way their days always began together.